Alright, so continuing on with that message being sent. So here you can see a different look at the axon terminal, also known as the synaptic bulb. And there it is right there. Here's our synaptic vesicles. And then they come here, they open up, they send out these neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters come and hit the receptors on the dendrite of um, of the other neuron or on receptors on an organ. So this action potential depolarizes the membrane. We already talked about. It opens these calcium ion channels. See right here, these calcium ion channels. So then these neurotransmitter vesicles fuse with the membrane. It triggers, hey, come fuse. They release the neurotransmitter, and then that neurotransmitter binds with this protein receptor, and it opens these ion-gated channels. So then the neurotransmitter is either degraded or reabsorbed. Notice we had an electrical signal going through our neuron. Now, right here with the neurotransmitter, this is a chemical signal. So it's kind of a conservation of energy. We've just changed the type of energy. Alright, the neurotransmitters you need to know, one is acetylcholine, which transmits the signal to skeletal muscle. And so it'll stimulate the muscles either to contract or inhibit the action potential. And acetylcholine is released in the parasympathetic system. We'll talk about what that looks like in a bit. Then epinephrine, which is adrenaline, or norepinephrine, causes our fight or flight response, and that's released in the central nervous system. GABA is released in the central nervous system and is an inhibitor. Dopamine is widespread in the brain. It affects sleep, mood, attention, learning. If you don't have enough dopamine, then it could cause Parkinson's disease, and if you have too much dopamine, it could be that you have schizophrenia. There's also serotonin, which is widespread in the brain, and it also affects sleep, mood, attention, and learning. So these neurotransmitters are kind of a weak point of the nervous system because any substance that affects these neurotransmitters or acts like them could affect nerve function. Things like nitrous oxide, carbon monoxide, stimulants like amphetamines, caffeine, nicotine, any depressants, Prozac, poisons, all of those will mess with the neurotransmitters and mess with your nervous system. Alright, so on top of the neurotransmitters, there's something special called acetylcholine esterase. And it's an enzyme which will break down acetylcholine, the neurotransmitter. And inhibitors of this esterase working to break it down are neurotoxins, things like snake venom or insecticides. So here, the acetylcholine esterase is at work breaking down the acetylcholine. And here, the snake toxin blocks the active site, so it's unable to break down the neurotransmitter. So it'll end up with too much acetylcholine. Alright, so now that we've talked all about the neurons, we're going to move on to the overall nervous system. How does it work? So it's in two parts. The central nervous system, the neurons in your brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, the PNS, which is everything else. Just because it's called peripheral does not mean it is less important. It's then broken down into two parts, the somatic system, which controls voluntary movements, such as your eyes moving as you read this, and then also the autonomic system, which controls all involuntary motions, such as heartbeat or digestion. It's a handoff system between the two. So that's between the somatic and the autonomic. So the somatic system, you may choose not to breathe for a moment. And then I give it back over to my autonomic system and I let it think for itself as to when I need to breathe. So here's our beautiful chart. Nervous system, central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. That's all it is. Peripheral nervous system has sensory pathways and motor pathways. Then these motor pathways break down into our voluntary and involuntary nervous system, the somatic and autonomic. And then finally, the autonomic system breaks down into the sympathetic and parasympathetic division, and they're kind of opposite. The sympathetic division produces energy, that's our fight or flight area, and the parasympathetic division calms your body back down and returns it back to maintenance mode, like resting and digesting. So that's the overview of the nervous system. Now we're going to talk specifically about the brain. So here's your brain. You've got a forebrain, all in here, a midbrain, right in here, and then the hindbrain, which is mostly this bottom section of the brain. Okay, so forebrain, midbrain, hindbrain. Here's another way of remembering it. If you were to put the swim cap on your head, here's your corpus callosum. This is your cerebrum, the biggest part of your brain here. Here's the midbrain, the pons, the medulla oblongata, the spinal cord, the cerebellum, the hypothalamus, the thalamus, all of that in here. So let's go back one more time. So here's the cerebrum, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the cerebral cortex, the pituitary gland, controls a lot of hormones, the midbrain right there, see it's in the middle of your brain, and the hindbrain is made of the pons, the medulla oblongata, see it's like an oval here, and the cerebellum, this big offshoot. And here's your spinal cord. So there are functional divisions of the brain. So here's the hindbrain, where it regulates essential autonomic and integrative functions. So it's kind of the brain stem. It's got the pons, the medulla oblongata, and then the midbrain is right above it. Then the midbrain has, then we also have the cerebellum, the thalamus, the hypothalamus are kind of above the midbrain here in the forebrain. So, those divisions in the brain, what do they do? What's the difference between all these things? Well, the cerebrum controls all voluntary activities. It receives and interprets sensory information and is the largest part of your brain. The cerebellum coordinates muscle activity and movement or balance. The medulla oblongata is the control center for involuntary activities. The hypothalamus is our thermostat and our hunger and thirst meter. So it regulates homeostasis, says, oh, you're too cold, get warm. You're hungry, get more food, and returns you back to normal. It also secretes hormones and regulates the pituitary gland. The medulla controls involuntary actions like breathing or heartbeat. The pons connects two sections and has the respiratory center in it. The midbrain controls visual and auditory reflexes. The thalamus is the sensory relay for the spinal cord and the cerebrum, so it's kind of like the operator. And the amygdala controls impulsive emotions and anger. So the cerebrum is the most highly evolved structure of mammalian brain. It's got the outer gray matter, which is the cerebral cortex, and then the inner white matter. The cerebrum is divided into two hemispheres, and it's divided by the corpus callosum, which is the major connection between the two hemispheres. It's also a thick band of nerve fibers that lets the two sides communicate to each other. So there's our corpus callosum right there. So that lateralization of brain function, what does it do? Well, the left hemisphere controls things like language, math, logic, visual and auditory details, like detailed activities required for motor control. And then the right hemisphere controls things like spatial relationships, nonverbal ideation, so like drawings, things like that, emotional processing, all of that. All right, then the cerebrum specialization. Different regions are specialized for different functions, and it's got different 4 lobes. The frontal, temporal, occipital, and parietal. So here's the frontal, here's the temporal, here's the parietal, and at the very back is our occipital lobe. So in the frontal lobe we've got speech, motor cortex, In the parietal lobe, we have some more speech, taste, reading, so on. Temporal, smell, hearing, auditory. Occipital is a lot of visual. So here's an image of the different things it controls. So here's part of our lobe in here. So you've got the primary motor cortex, swallowing, the tongue, jaw, lips, face, eyebrow, neck. So it kind of goes on and stretches its way out. And then here we've got things like the tongue, the gums, the jaw, thumb. So this is what it looks like in these two little sections here. Alright, so lobes of the brain. The frontal lobe controls speech and the motor cortex. The parietal lobe, speech, taste, reading, and somatosensory. The occipital lobe controls vision, and the temporal lobe is hearing and smell. So those are your simple breakdowns. Alright, there is also the limbic system, and it mediates basic emotions like fear or anger, which are involved in emotional bonding. It also establishes emotional memory. So for those of you who read Divergent, the limbic system would be what they are targeting with their serums. So this amygdala is involved in recognizing emotional content of facial expression. So right there's your amygdala and the hippocampus. Taste, vision, hearing, touch. You can kind of see how they're all correlated in there. Alright, so overall nervous system, let's walk through a few things. Simplest nerve circuit is a reflex, which is just an automatic response. Doctor hits your knee with the little rubber hammer, and it sends the signal. Rapid response, because it's automated. The signal goes straight to the spinal cord, doesn't go to your brain doesn't even think about it. Just goes to the spinal cord says, alright, kick. So it's just an essential action. You don't have to make decisions about it. Things like blinking, keeping your balance, your pupils dilating when you go outside or walk inside, or when you're startled. So here's an eye blink or a pain withdrawal reflex. You've got the stimulus. This is a tack. You step on something sharp. Receptor in the skin goes, ouch, that hurts. It says, hey, something just poked me. So it goes through the sensory neuron, through the interneuron. Here's the gray matter of your brain. Here's the white. Here's white matter. Oh, in the spinal cord, here's the gray matter. Here's the white matter. So it goes straight through in your spinal cord, interneuron, off to the motor neuron to tell the muscle what to do. So that is it for the nervous system.